welcome everyone. I'm so happy you're here. This turned into an accidental keynote somehow, but that's cool. I've always wanted to give a keynote, so here we are. Running a conference, turns out it's kind of really hard. So as Alex mentioned, I am a senior staff engineer at Slack. I've been there for quite some time. But I think the most important thing about me is that I'm actually from my hometown is the birthplace of Poutine, or Poutine as Anglophones like to call it. And if you hear anyone say that Poutine is from Victoriaville, they are lying to you. It is from Drummondville. And the best Poutine is at Lemaire fromagerie, so if you're there, check it out. I doubt you will ever find yourself in Drummondville, Quebec, but if you have been warned. So I've been at Slack for 7.5 years, which I'm not saying this to impress you or make you feel bad that my 4-year cliff is long past, but more to give context about all the things that I've seen there. And for a little bit of that context, here's what message send rates per day looks like across all of Slack. When I started on Monday, October 3rd, 2016, there was about 110 million messages being sent per day. And this is where we are last week, because I didn't pull data from today. Last Friday, we were at 786 million. And actually, our busiest days are Tuesdays, so I should have maybe grabbed data from Tuesdays. Whatever, I'll do it next time. If you care about number of Slackbot messages sent per day, this is for you. It's about 11 million last week. Slackbot does accidentally DM itself sometimes. I can tell you about it afterwards. It's like kind of a whole thing. So I've been there for a while, and here are a smattering of things that I've worked on. I've worked on very big refactors. I ended up sort of writing a book about it. I've worked on HHVM, which if you didn't know, Slack runs on top of HHVM. We use Hacklang, which is Meta/Facebook's PHP-flavored programming language. I've worked on Enterprise Grid. That was like the hot second that I worked on actual product development before focusing on working on performance for Enterprise Grid. And I've worked on a number of core libraries. Part of the problem with being on HHVM and Hacklang is that the open source community is not very big, and so you have to write a lot of your own core libraries on your own. But right now, I work mostly on backend performance, and that's actually kind of been a thread throughout my entire time there, and I work specifically on load testing. But what a lot of things here have in common, and also you might note, there's no SRE in here. I'm not an infra as code person. I've had the infra title in my name sort of accidentally for some time because of some reorgs. I'm not an SRE. I've sat in a number of incidents, and I can tell you about all of those later, but that's just not who I have been. And so take everything that I say with sort of a grain of salt, but hopefully you'll learn something from today. And to go back, sort of the things that these have in common is that I had no business doing any of these things. When I started at Slack, I think I was a 1.5 years out of school. I have no idea why these people trusted me to do all the things that I did, but this continued to be a theme. They just kept trusting me to do bigger and bigger things. And part of what happens when you work at a big company, well, a small company at the time, a small company that has all these really, really big problems and only this number of people to tend to them, is you have to trust your more junior people. You have to just give them something and say, have fun, go at it, right? And so I've been really lucky to be put in those situations over and over and over again. And that's still true today, even though that I have a fancier title and I have more tenure. People still trust me to solve problems that I'm wildly unqualified to solve. And today, this is the story of one such problem. So I'm going to set the stage and talk about October 2020. And we had a number of incidents that were not fun. And not all of these were published to status.slack.com, but it was not a good time. And if this was around October 16th, and our SVP of engineering came into the engineering channel at the time and said, our quarterly uptime, assuming 100% for the rest of October, so the rest of the month for those 2 weeks, is only going to be 99.96, so the dreaded 3 nines. And that would have been our lowest quarterly uptime in over a year, regardless of whether we made it to 100% at the end of the month. We'd done a great job for a really long time, but unfortunately, a lot of things were catching up to us, and October was just not the month for us, especially on an infrastructural standpoint. And this is a lot of words. You don't have to read them. The slides will be posted later. But Essentially, we had an S1, a SEV1, because we had a new HHVM build that was promoted, and we saw an elevated spike in 500s. Then we saw a significant decrease in API success rate because of memcache, something, something console. We've all been there. And then again, we saw degradation because memcache, microuter, something, something. And if, I told you I'm not an infrastructure person. Well, I mean, I understand the outcome of these, but you know. But there's something that all these changes had in common, and you'd probably have to squint really hard to figure out what that is, other than memcache. Memcache was not in a good place at the time. You probably gathered as much. But the thing that they all had in common was all of these changes were merged to and later deployed from something that we called chef-repo. And in December, one of our engineers made this nifty little diagram that shows all of the things that are in chef-repo. And this is not exactly the state that it was in October 2020, obviously, but it's still very true. And so we have a bunch of Terraform files, and we have a bunch of chef cookbooks, as you would expect from a repo called chef-repo. Some tooling scripts, some utility scripts, some Kubernetes stuff, more chef cookbooks down there. Not much has changed. One thing to note, though, is that deployments of our main backend monolith, which houses all of our main business logic and our clients, that doesn't live here. That lives in another repo called web app. Love good repo names. And so, but there was still a significant amount of stuff that was housed here, right? So if you want to push a new version of Airflow that does all of this data stuff, you have to touch chef-repo. If you want to push a new version of Vitesse and update our databases, you go to chef-repo. Do you want to make changes to our routing infrastructure? You go to chef-repo. A lot of big, important pieces. So you get it. And then what happened after all of these incidents? Well, we instituted a code freeze. So, woo, who likes a code freeze? Wow, some actual hands. I'll find you later. No, OK, that was a strong no afterwards. Good, good. I also do not like them. And yeah, that wasn't very good. It very quickly turned into what I like to call a code slush, though, where we established this change advisory board, because we knew that changes were going to need to go out eventually, right? We needed to keep Slack up and running, and as we saw, a lot of important things were housed in chef-repo. So we established this cab, and it met 9 times a week, twice daily in the mornings and afternoons, except on Friday afternoons, to review proposed changes. And it was mostly time zone friendly, because a lot of the folks who submit pull requests to chef-repo live in Australia, and there's also a huge team in Dublin, and so you have to make these times friendly to all of these groups. And changes ended up being submitted to a channel called Infra Change Control, because we're Slack, and so everything lives in a channel, unsurprisingly. And we required the person reviewing them to provide status updates and visibility updates in the channel. And that sort of looked like this initially, where you had a little workflow, and you would like pop in, answer all these questions, and you'd pop in a link to your PR, and you say why this was super crucial for you to merge and get going. And we sort of operated like this for a little while. But you may be wondering, who the heck were these people? Who are the people sitting on cab? Who are reviewing these PRs? And I'm so glad you asked that question, because that is an important question to be asking. And turns out it was mostly our most senior engineers, so both in title and in tenure. And it was also leadership, so senior directors and our SVP of engineering was sitting in on these meetings sometimes. And leadership trusted those engineers to know the ins and outs of chef-repo and understand the potential implications of all these changes that people were suggesting. And they knew about the circular dependencies and all the crazy stuff that could maybe happen. But the monetary cost associated with those meetings was wild. I did some rough math at some point because I was just curious, right? And it's a bunch of senior staff engineers or staff engineers, and it's a senior director, all of these people sitting in this meeting. And it turns out it was probably around $5,000 to run these meetings weekly, at least, which is a lot of money. And so that was clearly untenable, and also no one wanted to keep doing this forever. So you're probably wondering, okay, how long do we have to do this? How long will this continue? this can't just be the new status quo. We have to be doing something to improve our ability to safely make changes to how all these core systems operate so we can go back to safely and reliably building stuff. And this is where I have some good news. People at Slack are generally good and smart people. And so we, again, created another channel. Because, Slack, we create lots of channels. You should aggressively leave and archive channels. This is just me being my Slack person here to all of you. Noise is high, I'm very sorry. Aggressively leave and archive channels. Infrastructure safety. So these are the big ideas that we came up with, and I'll go into each of these a little bit more individually. So reducing risk. We went through all of the systems built and deployed via chef-repo, and we categorized them as low, medium, or high risk based on the following categories. And this is something that our SRE team came up with. Observability, resiliency, readiness, ability to rescue, and blast radius of deploy. So observability, obviously amount of insights, how real time they are, that sort of thing. Resiliency, does the system have high availability single region clusters, right? Do clients use distributed systems best practices, load shedding, avoid thundering herds, that sort of thing. Readiness, does the system have automated test coverage? How are the runbooks? Do they exist? Maybe they should. Ability to rescue, can you roll back? Can you undo that PR and revert and roll back? Blast radius of deploy, can we manually trigger incremental rollouts? What's the visibility there? Again, to go back to the observability piece. Everything was scored on a scale from 1 to 4, and then the average of the scores was used to classify a system's total profile. So we had this nifty little program in place. And then we also wanted to build out automated testing via Test Kitchen. Actually, Brett Pemberton, who's a coworker of mine, and Lee London, who unfortunately couldn't make the talk because he was sick, but he did write the slides, so I'm giving him credit. They spoke about this at SREcon back in October, EMEA, so you can find their conference talk on the website there. And then finally, enabling gradual rollouts for a broader set of our systems that currently had very low blast radius scores. Think we merge this thing and then it goes out to 100% within a couple seconds. All right, goals. Great, sound completely achievable, they'd effectively address many of our concerns. And we thought we'd make significant enough progress on all of these so that CAB would probably only last 4 weeks. That was our goal. Now for the bad news. It did not take 4 weeks. And I'm going to now take bets from the audience on how long it took. 6 months? How much? 4? OK, 1 year. Oof. It's stuck. I love that answer. That's a really good answer. 6 months was very close. Well done. 7 months. So remember, the freeze began on October 21st, 2020, a couple days after that last big incident. And honestly, people just kind of ran out of steam. I don't know if you remember what October 2020 was like, but at least here in the US, the presidential election was happening and had happened shortly afterwards. Then there was a third wave of COVID, Thanksgiving, American Thanksgiving. As a Canadian, I'm legally obligated to say American Thanksgiving. Christmas, New Year, and then shortly after the holidays, we had this really traumatic period of time called the January 6th riots. Everything was feeling pretty grim, I know. Don't worry, the rest of the talk is a little bit more uplifting. But we were nearing a year, right, of near total lockdown for so many of us, and Zoom fatigue was really real. These were, in fact, and I'm not being facetious when I say this, unprecedented times. It was a rough time. And if the pause, there's another piece to it, and which is, I believe that if the pause had forced product development teams, those teams writing features, to slow down to the pace that we were forcing infrastructural teams to slow down their work with CAB, we probably would have figured out a way out of CAB much, much faster, even given the entire, and I hate to say this word, macroeconomic trends. But the thing is, only a really small subset of Slack engineering was committing code to chef-repo. And I actually pulled the numbers to ascertain this. And so for the year sort of June to June, which encompasses in the middle that code slush, we had 333 distinct contributors to chef-repo. In the month preceding, we had 170, and then the total PR count in that month preceding was around 2,500. On web app, which is where most of our product development, business logic, and all that stuff live. Very different numbers, a lot more people, like 7,000 PRs in a month. Our GitHub Enterprise instance has had some times where it has been less happy with us. And I think you can have an engineering leadership team that's all in on supporting their infrastructure organization, but there's nearly always going to be a more compelling case to speed up product development over infrastructural changes, and I think that's just sort of the space we live in. And I'm happy for anyone to come and disagree with me afterwards and have a conversation about that. But the way that I've seen things play out, that's sort of how it goes. And all that to say that for a while, CAB, for those 7 months, CAB did become status quo, even if we really did not intend for it to be. And in the background, we had those engineers working on those 3 big initiatives that I talked about earlier. And it's worth mentioning, too, that we were constantly reevaluating the risk level of services via that matrix that I talked about earlier. And more sections, more subsections of chef-repo were being exempted from going through this CAB process so that data engineers could go do their thing that didn't impact actual production and not have to go through CAB to review every single change, that sort of thing. But by and large, most infrastructure engineers did need to present to the change advisory board regularly, and it was kind of a meh experience. And honestly, it was really easy for the rest of the org, me included, to kind of go, not my problem. But it's worth mentioning that this whole time, I am technically on the infrastructure team, and I'm running load test tooling, among other things. And but I didn't actually have to go to CAB because most of the systems that I work on were built and deployed outside of chef-repo until March 16th, 2021, and I showed up to CAB for the first time. And it was a low-risk change, so review happened asynchronously in channel, and it was fine. But the friction of the whole process really stuck with me, and I was also really surprised by how intimidated I felt about the whole thing. At the time, I was a staff engineer. I'd been at Slack almost 5 years. Like, I knew all these people that were reviewing my PR. I had worked with them physically in an office. We were all buddies. I was surprised at how intimidating it all felt. And I thought, holy crap, how are other people doing this who started remotely or who are 2 years out of school? What the heck? And as happens when things really bother me, and my husband can attest to this, I can't stop talking about them. And so I had a bunch of conversations with coworkers and my manager about the general CAB experience. And I really couldn't get over the fact that this was 5 months later, and we still hadn't found a way to get rid of it, or to at least ease some of the friction around it. And so I went on my merry journey, and I was talking to a bunch of people, obviously in Slack, because it's Slack and that's what we do. And I built up this sort of mental Venn diagram of everyone's hopes and dreams. And so we have management wanted accountability. And I don't mean that in the blame way. We operate a blameless culture at Slack, and I'm very happy about that. But in they want mutual responsibility as an organization for keeping high standards, keeping the high standards of safety and reliability. And they wanted people to hop on a call from understand the risk profile of changes being merged. They wanted to be able to hop on a call with a not so pleased customer that we had some kind of outage that affected them, and be able to explain with confidence what happened, and also talk about what we were doing to prevent that from ever happening again. How many managers in the room? Okay, a decent number. I'd say maybe 35%. So how many of you have had to write an RCA or get on a call with a customer that was unhappy? Yeah. How many of you would say that was fun? All right, okay, nope, that turned into a nope. All right, cool. Yeah, that doesn't seem super fun. I've sat in on some of those calls, but as an engineer, sort of on the side as moral support, I don't know. They're not fun. They are not a pleasant experience. So on the other side, right, engineers wanted to get their development velocity back. which like, yeah, I did too. And they wanted to regain their independence as individual teams to own and build the features that they'd planned to build without having to go explain to these very senior, albeit very nice, very kind engineers what the heck they were trying to build, and these folks had very little context. So building up that context for someone with this like cab reviewer title to review your change is kind of a pain in the butt. So what I was starting to notice, though, is that there was quite a bit of overlap between these two groups and what they wanted. They wanted trust, they wanted reliability, and they wanted to get their effing time back. Which, like, yeah, I did too. But there was also this false dichotomy emerging where management and engineering were sort of pitted against each other in this like David Goliath story. And on the management side, it seemed to be, at least to me from the engineering perspective and from what I was hearing from other engineers, that we can only release safe, reliable code if it's properly vetted and approved by domain experts and engineering leadership. That is the only way we can do it. And then on the engineering side, engineers were saying, ICs are the code base experts. We're working on these features. We know what it is, and velocity should be prioritized to ensure safety, reliability. They go hand in hand, right? If we slow down development, and most importantly, deployments, our muscles are gonna atrophy and we're not gonna know how to do that really well. Totally valid, both sides. And then the other thought I was starting to have when I was talking to all these people, and I should have maybe been doing something else with my workday, but that's okay, is that isn't CAB essentially just really good code review? Right? Like these people were just reviewing code that was coming into this channel. Isn't it just good code review? And why can't we teach what the CAB reviewers know to everyone else so everyone else can essentially be a CAB reviewer? And this is where I want to take a little sidebar. In the channel for this set of talks, in the thread for this talk, I would love for you to put what makes a good code review in the thread. I'll be reading some of them off later, so if you don't want it read, then maybe don't put it in there for risk of getting it read. But this will come into play later. I just would love to gather folks' ideas about what makes good code review. So I was talking to my manager about all these things, as I do, and she told me, okay, but like, why don't you build that training? Why don't you teach people what makes a CAB reviewer? Have you met me? And in that moment, I was like, I am the least qualified person in the infrastructure organization to do this. I wasn't a CAB reviewer myself. I had made 9 ever PRs to chef-repo in my like close to 5 years there. And what about the SRE team, right? They're shepherding the whole process. They're the ones closest to it. They're setting the guidelines, all of this stuff. But then my manager astutely reminded me about the all-important beginner's mind. How many of you know about the beginner's mind? Okay, general, maybe like 50%. So it refers to having an attitude of openness, eagerness, and lack of preconceptions when studying or learning something, even if you're like an advanced person. And so she was telling me, right, who to better write a training about how to become a CAB reviewer than someone who is the furthest thing from a CAB reviewer. You will have to learn all of the things, and you will be able to write down all the things you had to learn, and then that will be the training. But that wasn't the only reason why she thought I would be uniquely qualified to do this. And the other piece was the social capital piece, which is really important in an organization. So I had spent close to 5 years at this point building up a ton of social capital with not just my fellow engineers, but also the management team on the infrastructure side. And maybe that's from using a lot of emojis and messages. I'm guilty. But I'm a very curious person, and I talk to a lot of people, and probably you can tell I'm up here talking to all of you about this. I have what one of my teammates calls the gab. I have difficulty turning that off. And so I'd built all of this rapport with all of these people, and they trusted me to get stuff done. So I thought, okay, maybe she's right. Maybe I am the right person for the job. So we pitched it to senior leadership, and they said, do your best. And I came up with something called CAB deputies. And we did get actual badges, and they have the little chef logo on them. One of the principal engineers 3D printed them and shipped them out to a bunch of the original CAB deputies, which was really fun. And the goal of CAB deputy was sort of this. So build this code review training to all committers of chef-repo. They would all take it. And then we would create an assessment to test their cab review skills. And then we would teach and onboard progressively larger groups of people. And the goal here was to address most, if not all, of the pain points from that previous Venn diagram. So let's talk about how that would fix engineers' pain points. First, we would distribute the load. We would add at least 2 deputies per team or product area and distribute those regionally so we had optimal turnout for PR reviews. We'd reinforce engineers' understandings of chef-repo shenanigans because there were many shenanigans. And honestly, like a lot of infrastructure engineers, particularly newer ones, but also more junior ones, were really worried about making changes at this point. They had been in this code slush for a long time. And then we also wanted to bring a renewed curiosity to code review. And I'll sort of get into that a little bit later. Then for the management perspective, this is how we were hoping to solve it. So we, one, would free up engineering management time. And we would deliver accurate aggregate data on the kinds of PRs that were merged and timely insights into the kinds of incidents that were rooted in chef-repo PRs. And then we'd also bring this sort of sense of renewed accountability to code review. So you can see how maybe these are mirrored. So this was the training. It was like very straightforward. It was just like a big rambly Google Doc. And there's a recorded version of me talking essentially through the doc that folks can watch if they care to do that. But I highly recommend that folks mostly just read the doc. And at the start of the doc, there's the goals, right? We talk about blast radius. You have to be able to determine the blast radius of a PR. Is it testable? If it is, does it have tests? If it is not, why isn't it? And hopefully there's a good reason there. Observability, what metrics and dashboards are you going to be watching when this rolls out? And then finally, rescue plan. Is there a rollback plan? Can we feature flag the change? If we can't, why not, et cetera. And if these sound familiar, it's because I just straight up copy pasted them from all the work the SRE team did earlier in establishing the risk level of these different systems. Nothing here was new. I just took the work that people were already doing and I put it into a Google Doc. That's really all I did. All right, so these pieces were sort of the overall training. There was a chef and chef-repo architecture refresh. Mostly that linked out to other docs that much more capable human beings had written. There was a little blurb about how to determine risk level and blast radius. Logistics, the actual logistics of how you end up reviewing a PR as a cab deputy. And then we had a huge section that was just example PRs with corresponding risk and blast radius profiles for all of them. Because I don't know about you, but I am a terrible abstract learner. I learn best by doing and by looking at examples. And I figured if I am like that, probably a lot of other people are like this as well. And so I thought examples were really key here. And I solicited all of these examples. Again, nothing here was unique. None of this was really me doing any of this. I just asked other people. I reached out to my friend Brett, and I was like, send me PRs that are examples on these 4 quadrants, right? That's high risk, but low blast radius. And that's high blast radius, but also high risk, right? This red zone. And I asked Maude, and I asked a bunch of other folks, send me these PRs. I want to collate them, and I want to understand them, and I want to put them in this doc for other people to look through. And then I did the exact same thing, so solicited feedback from a bunch of my coworkers, because to be honest, a lot of them are much smarter than I am. And I asked them for example questions. What is a question you love to see on a PR, right? What question has someone asked you recently that really made you stop and think? And I wanted to collate all of those questions and put them in the doc directly there for people to consume. And this is where we come back to what makes a good code review. So I'm going to pull up the thread, and I'm going to look at, oh, there's so much good stuff in here. All right, code review that is actually read and understood versus just click approved. I agree. Sharing expertise about potentially risky choices being made. Yes. Alignment, empathy, trust. That's really good. Asking questions. Hey, Brian, we're on the same page. Asking, what is the risk of this, and have we mitigated it? This is great, yeah. Spreading knowledge so that the reviewer also is equally aware of the workings of what was added. Exactly, so you probably know my thought on this at this point. Oh, and I would be remiss to, one of my coworkers, Glenn, has this wonderful Medium blog post about what makes good code review. You should all read it. He'll be very embarrassed that I put this in the slide, which makes this all the better. And what I think makes a great code review, obviously, is questions. I love this. This is one of my favorite things that I've seen on the internet recently. I dropped off of all social media a little while ago, but someone sent me this, and I had to put it here. And I might say that I'm going to go one step further. And honestly, it's just questions. I'm just glad that someone is taking the time to ask me questions in my pull request. And the number of times that I've sat there and read a seemingly simple question like this and been like, oh, right, that's not going to work, that all of my assumptions were wrong, is very high. Like, I would not be standing here today, still enjoying my job, doing all the things, have grown to the degree that I've grown if it wasn't for people asking good questions on my PRs. And I sifted through a bunch of pre-code Slush PRs in doing all of this, and I kept finding instances where engineers put up a PR for review with like a one-sentence PR description, and a teammate just approved it like 2 minutes later. And sometimes that's fine, like you're fixing a typo or whatever, but there's probably at least one thing to raise, or at least, hey, your PR description is only one sentence. Maybe there's a little bit more context to add here. And I always encourage folks to think about what you, 3 years from now, would like to see in this PR as context. Not even thinking about the intern that maybe is on your team, but literally like, the number of times that I've had to go back and look at code, or this happened to me a couple weeks ago, someone sent me a commit that I made in 2017 in Slack and was like, oh, what was the idea here? And I just stared at my Slack and I was like, oh no. But sure enough, I found the PR and it linked to a Jira ticket, and I had like 2 paragraphs describing what the heck was going on there, and I was able to actually answer the question. But had I not had all that context, forget it, I would have no idea why the heck I wrote that like 2 lines of code. So a big part of cab deputies was just asking questions, being inquisitive, breaking out of your shell, and just asking that one question. And these are some of the questions, and I will not stop on the slide, and the slides will be shared, so you can go read them later if you care. But not only did cab deputies have to determine the risk and blast radius level of a PR, they also had to come up with at least one question. Now, I will be the first to admit that that sort of has fallen off in the last couple years since we've implemented this. But every so often, I'll show up on a PR and I'm like, you haven't asked a question. And people know to expect those DMs from me, or to just expect it straight up on the PR. So if there's one thing you take away from this talk today, ask questions. Ask questions in your PRs, please. Please, thank you. So, quiz. Everyone hates a quiz, right? Or, I mean, some people really love quizzes, I guess. I don't know. Assessments really freaked me out in school. The quiz, what did the quiz constitute of? Remember when I talked about learning by doing and examples? The quiz was exactly that. Again, none of this was original. I created none of this. The quiz was just 4 different chef-repo PRs with different risk and blast radius profiles, and you had to determine what that was, ask some questions to the PR author, and that was it. Gain some additional context on why you thought the risk level was it was, why you thought the blast radius level was what it was. And it was all open book, right? These were real PRs. People had actually reviewed these PRs and merged them. And none of this was a trick, right? Because work is open book. You can DM your teammate and ask them a question. And that's also what I was trying to recreate here, is the idea of collaboration. We are all in this together. We are all equally responsible for maintaining this level of safety and trust in our systems. And of note, it was required to get an 80% score to give someone cab deputy status. But we gave people opportunities to retry. We gave them feedback. We didn't obviously give them the answers, but we gave them feedback. Hey, you didn't provide enough context on your explanations for why it was the risk level that it was. And so people had time to go back and really think. Logistics, this is how it worked. You put up some GitHub tags on the PR. You gave a very brief description of the risk level and the blast radius. You asked a question. You moved on. And this is another example from, again, my teammate Glenn, who's going to hate that I did this, but I love that he's going to hate that I did this, of a higher spiciness level PR that was both a high blast radius and a high risk PR. From the management perspective, this is sort of what the logistics look like. So we had a weekly review of all the GitHub tags. I aggregated all the GitHub data using the GitHub API. I looked at all the incidents that were maybe tagged or related to a chef-repo PR. And I looked at code climate, specifically the PR velocity data, et cetera. And we'd periodically invite folks to talk through the cab approved changes that were related to those chef-repo incidents. But it wasn't, again, a blameful situation. It was just, we wanted to gather insight. What did we miss, right? What could we have done differently? And does anything need to be added to the cab review, cab deputy process in order to catch this thing next time? And this is a little bit of what it looked like. Again, we were looking at risk level, blast radius level, whether people were using future flags or not. We looked at this code climate data and the number of incidents. And we did this on a weekly basis for a little while. Going back to the engineering perspective, so we held multiple live trainings across multiple time zones. Again, Slack is very distributed. So we started that in mid-April 2021. We first trained the non-cab approver chef experts. So it's the people who basically would have been cab reviewers, but who weren't, because I wanted their feedback on what the heck the whole training process was missing. So we incorporated that. We kept doing these trainings. Eventually, I recorded myself doing the training because there was no way I was going to keep doing this. You have to learn how to scale yourself. That's like a big thing when you go up the ladder or whatever. And within a month, we trained over 20 engineers, thus tripling the number of people who could approve chef-repo PRs. And this was across nearly all infrastructure teams operating in chef-repo regularly. And 6 weeks later, on May 27th, my Slack is in French, I'm sorry. It really throws off people sometimes when I log bug reports and they're like, what? And I'm like, don't worry, my Slack's in French, it's okay. 6 weeks later, we archived the channel. Everything was cab deputies. And so if you wanted to be able to move a little faster, you wanted to understand the ins and outs of chef-repo, we just pushed you in the direction of becoming a cab deputy. And that's sort of all it was. On the management side, a few months later, after 2-ish months in July, we dropped the weekly metrics sync, moving to once a month. I was very glad to do that at that point because I was very pregnant. And I needed to offload all of this stuff before I birthed a child. And after another 2 months into September, a month before my due date, we dropped the meeting entirely, which, like, thank goodness. That was actually a really good timeline for me, just forcing that imminently, handing that off. And now it's part of the regular onboarding process. About 3-ish months after you start at Slack, maybe 4, you get a JIRA ticket assigned to you that says, hey, if you work in chef-repo, maybe you should consider becoming a cab deputy. And we've made a ton of significant progress on the goals set in infrastructure safety earlier, too. That was a really, really big piece. I can't claim that cab deputies was the only thing that made us move away from this whole process altogether. And again, you can watch Brett's talk to learn more about that. So cab deputies today, we have had 234 quiz submissions, 220 deputies, and growing. You can do the math on how many fails that means. And this is where we're at in terms of chef-repo contributions, which I polled last week. So district contributor count is 209, hasn't increased all that much. But the total PR count over even just the month leading up to the slush has increased significantly. And I don't know about you, but I haven't seen, at least knock on all of the wood. There's very little wood on the stage. All the wood that Slack is in a pretty reliable state. And with that, that's it.